I wanted to cover one last thing today, which is getting very little attention because the corporate media doesn't want to remind you that it helped cover up one of the greatest atrocities, I think, in modern history. And that would be the global financial crash, brought to you by the big banks, the government officials who have been bought off by those big banks, and many other people over the years, including Bill Clinton, who basically, because he signed Glass-Steagall repeal, which allowed banks to merge, investment banks to merge with commercial banks, that was the beginning of the wrecking ball that allowed the financial disaster that I keep hearing people have recovered from. Let me ask you before I cover this story, can you leave in the chat whether it's Facebook or the super chat? Have you recovered from the global financial crash? I'm taking a little poll here. Have you recovered? I don't know, because most people I talk to haven't recovered. Most people I talk to are living paycheck to paycheck. Most people I'm talking had their lifetime savings and retirement almost totally erased. Mike, no. I'm sure I'm sure when I go out, if I started talking to more people, you'd actually get the truth. So it's the 10-year anniversary of the global financial disaster, brought to you by the fact that the big banks played blackjack with your money. Nobody was held accountable. Patron Saint Barack Obama didn't jail one banker. He didn't put tougher regulations on banks. You want to say Dodd-Frank was tougher regulation? It was a Band-Aid to a gunshot wound. So, Matt Taibbi has this great story debunking the propaganda that the corporate media has put out. I want to read part of that. Matt Taibbi has done so much great reporting on what actually led to the financial crash, what actually led to the banks needing to be, quote, bailed out, and actually debunking the fact that we had to bail them out. So I want to read you part of his story, give you my thoughts too. Here we go. In the early days of the crash, reporters were told the crisis particulars were probably too complex for the news audience, but metaphors would do, and the operating metaphor for 2008 was a 1,000-year flood, a rare and inexplicable accident, something that just sort of happened. You know, it's like, yeah, I got her pregnant, it just happened. I don't know what I could have done to get her pregnant, she just got pregnant. It was even implied that the meltdown was due in part to irrational panic, hysteria, a fear of fear itself. When Lehman Brothers failed, the theory held, investors overreacted by freezing all lending, causing more disruption and more losses. The economy was basically healthy, but fear had caused it to founder on a lack of confidence. In Too Big to Fail, William Hurt plays Treasury Secretary Paulson as a saddened, wearied Atlas. He quips early in the mess, this is a confidence game, and if Lehman Brothers failed, all the other banks are going to drop like dominoes. This colorful language, dominoes, a confidence game, an iceberg, a storm, artfully disguised reality, this wasn't weather coming at them, but the consequences of years of untrammeled criminal fraud. That's what this was, fraud. Banks like Lehman had lent billions to fly-by-night mortgage mills like Countrywide and New Century. Those firms in turn sent hordes of loan hustlers into lower-income neighborhoods offering magical deals to anyone who could fog a mirror, as former Countrywide executive Michael Winston once put it to me. The targets were frequently minorities and the elderly. So he makes a great point, which doesn't get talked about a lot. The main victims of the financial crash, of course, white people were victims too, but African Americans and Latinos were the predominant victims of these crappy mortgages that all the banks knew they shouldn't have been handing out, that the government, the politicians knew this was going on. They just looked the other way because the banks kept filling their coffers. That's what they do. They don't care. The politicians don't care if the banks bring down the economy. They don't care if their constituents are left losing their homes, losing their retirements. I've met people that literally were without food because of this. So the media put out, like Matt Taibbi says, it was a perfect storm, a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It was an accident. Who could have thought? Who would have thought? Well, if you watched certain films, including The Big Short, there were plenty of people sounding the alarm that these banks are basically preying on minorities. They are preying on brown people. They are preying on poor white people, essentially, so that they could have another Gilded Age. That's called criminal fraud. So we're very focused as a media on Russian trolls. We're very focused on espionage and taking down, Russians interfering with our election. But we're not as focused on actual crimes. Crimes have a definition. These were crimes. This was criminal fraud. We're not worried about that. You want to know why? You ever watch Morning Joe? I do sometimes to torture myself. Well, they have advertisements from Bank of America. Vox, a digital website, brought to you their podcast, brought to you by Goldman Sachs. Right? All of these news outlets get sponsorship dollars from banks. Politico does an event series sponsored to you by Bank of America. There are ads on many things I see from JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The media is literally in bed with these banks. And by the way, you have outlets like CNBC. You have outlets like MSNBC. MSNBC is an anchor in the morning who used to be a Wall Street reporter, who thinks business could do no wrong, who thinks the banks have been wrongfully attacked. We have a media of elites that are covering up the greatest heist, the greatest bank robbery possibly in American history, actually in world history, what these banks were able to get away with. But we're arresting black people down in Dallas right now who protested against Botham Jean, a 26-year-old black man who was hanging out in his apartment one night, and a white police officer randomly intruded on his apartment and shot him dead. Did you know that nine people who were out at a protest against the fact that this police officer is not in jail until trial, 9 of them were in jail? I think they're still in jail, actually, for 48 hours. Yet criminal bank CEOs, criminal loan sharks, criminal bankers, they were fined. Slap on the wrist. Slap on the wrist. It's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable what the corporate media and the propaganda that gets out there. And you're not going to see any of it this week. Again, 10-year anniversary. So every year on 9/11, rightfully so, we pay tribute and we honor the victims. But no, global financial crash. Oh, that happened 10 years ago? Well, back to Trump. And don't get me wrong, I think the Kavanaugh scandal and the accusation against him should get a lot of coverage, but I'm not here. Jen, are you hearing much about this being the 10-year anniversary of the global financial crash?
No, really, only you mentioned it and some on Twitter.
Yeah. Go figure. Go figure. And by the way, going back to our GoFundMe, like you saw on the Young Turks, I'm going to be doing disappearing middle class tours also, where we're going to be going out all across America and interviewing, shocker, guess who? Real people about their struggles. And many of those people, their struggles, not that they didn't have struggles before the bank crash, but their struggles went from 0 to 60 because of the global financial crash brought to you by these banks. So I want to read you one more part of Taibbi's piece. Here's the link, by the way. I'll put it in the live chat if you want to read it. I love Matt Taibbi. I don't really respect that many journalists. He's one of them. Let me read to you one more part of this because it's really instructive, and I actually learned quite a bit from reading this piece. Myth number 3, he writes, the bailouts were about saving capitalism. The deal those bankers cooked up was to save the banks from capitalism. Losers must be allowed to lose, Taibbi writes. It's the first and most important regulatory mechanism in a market economy. But by 2008, the banks had simply grown too big and interconnected to allow normal market processes to take place. These firms almost certainly would have died without help. In 2011, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission released a report quoting then Fed Chief Ben Bernanke as saying this about the fateful week in September 2008. Out of maybe the 13 of the most important financial institutions in the United States, 12 were at risk of failure within a period of a week or two. Again, the legend is that the banks at the Fed that weekend were the healthy ones, saving us from the contagion of AIG and Lehman. This legend has been reinforced by constant propaganda about the big banks being forced to accept bailouts like TARP. It's a lie. Paulson and other regulators repeatedly intervened to prevent the natural demise of these firms. It wasn't just small market stopping moves like when they banned short selling to protect corrupt companies from smaller gamblers who'd wagered on their failure, or the deal made on September 19, 2008, when two companies that were not commercial banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, were given emergency commercial bank charters on a Sunday night, allowing the two plummeting giants access to life-saving Fed cash the next morning. The public, to this day, has no understanding of the scale of the intervention. To put it in perspective, the war on terror has cost America about $5.6 trillion since 9/11, or about $32 million an hour. So, Jeff Bezos makes $64,000 every 10 seconds. He makes $266 million a day, $32 million an hour. So we could be an endless war in Iraq, Afghanistan. The bailouts probably dwarf that effort. Most studies suggest it was a World War level mobilization of cash, a generation of savings used to plug a single hole. The Special Inspector General of the TARP put the gross government outlay at $4.6 trillion, with over $16 trillion in guarantees. Bloomberg concluded the rescue expenditure was $12.8 trillion. Fortune, which saluted the investment as hugely profitable for America in the end, put the number at $14 trillion. The Levy Institute at Bard College did probably the most extensive study and put the number at $29 trillion. Hey, I think we could pay for some healthcare with $29 trillion. I think we could pay for some education with $29 trillion. I think we could fix the roads with 29 children. I think we could give preschoolers pre-K. I think we can do a lot of things with $29 trillion. What do you think? Can we do some stuff with $29 trillion? I'm not as eloquent or informed as Matt Taibbi, but really what happened here would be the equivalent of me going into a bank, shooting a gun, stealing money, and then instead of arresting me, instead of letting me to rot in prison, probably shooting a gun, theft, kidnapping, possibly some kidnapping in there, you're talking 25 to 30. Instead of that, they would basically, this is the equivalent of them walking me to a massage parlor, making sure I was pampered, get a nice day spa, then take me into a hearing, say some verbal, condemn me verbally, and then fine me for shooting my gun, terrorizing people, and stealing their money. Oh, and letting me keep the money. And then not only letting me keep the money, but giving me a profit on top of it. This is what happened. This is what happened. This is the greatest theft. This is the greatest bank robbery in American and world history. And by the way, there's no telling it's not going to happen again. I'm not an economist, but there's several other bubbles out there. There is the fracking bubble. There is the student loan bubble, which is very close to popping. $6 trillion in Iraq, $29 trillion for the banks. I thought we have no money for healthcare. I thought we have no money for education. If you haven't noticed yet, folks, America is not the United States of America. It's the United Corporations of America. And essentially what the legacy of the bailouts and the government basically, that's not even corporate welfare. That is corporate welfare on steroids, what they did to these banks, is basically making it so capitalism, which already is BS, we don't actually even live in a capitalist economy, it basically made it so as private enterprise, people and companies could do whatever the hell they want, and if they fail, there is no risk of going out of business. There is no risk of criminal consequences if you do illegal things. That is the legacy of the global financial crash. The banks know they can do whatever they want. They can defraud their customers. They can prey on minorities and vulnerable people without the expertise to know that they are purchasing toxic, whether it's toxic housing loans or other financial instruments. That's not a free market, that's a vulture market. And that is why we need to move to a socialist economy. Socialism doesn't mean you can't make money. It means there are regulations and there are safeguards in for the citizens. Sounds good to me. With that, I am going to wrap up this live stream. Again, tomorrow is my birthday. If you want to give me a present, the GoFundMe link is right there in the description of this video. Cannot thank you enough to all the people. I think over 50 people now have contributed, and we're at like 3,700, I believe. Could be wrong. So we're close to 4,000, trying to get to 5,000 this week. So it's definitely a stretch, but we're trying to do it. I can't thank you guys enough because I understand that everyone nobody watching is probably, super wealthy. So thank you for the contributions. Again, this GoFundMe is not our business plan. This is to give us a little bit of a spark plug, a little bit of a catalyst to get out in the field so that we could start our business. So at 12 o'clock, I'll be 32. If you want to give me a birthday gift, GoFundMe.com/status, GoFundMe.com/status-coup-news. I will be live tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time.